And we're live. Welcome, everybody. Random Acoustic Thoughts right here. My special guest, once again, Joshua City from 86 Boxing. What's up, brother?
What's going on, Random? You're far too kind, far too kind. Special guest, come on, come on. But no,
Very
happy to
special
be here.
guest, and very special guest even. Great to have you back again. You released today, I saw a notification about 20 minutes ago. You released a Harry Greb video today. So I got in touch to see if you wanted to have a little chat. Where's the thing? I took a little still shot, a screenshot. There we go, 45 and 0 in 1 year. So I wanted to just to bring you on and thank you for coming on. Just to ask you, you know, how crazy was this year? Just go off on it a little bit.
Yeah, appreciate you bringing it up. Yeah, Harry Greb, what more can we say about him? You know, he's one of those fighters who has such a legendary career. It's hard to even pinpoint one particular time in his career, but definitely the year 1919 stands out in some sense because it's the year that he actually went 45 and 0. And one of the things that made me want to even dive into this and make a or create a video for it was the fact that I know we often get caught up in the records here in modern times, or at least the modern boxing fan, especially the casual fan. They can see a record, an undefeated record in particular, and make the assumption that, okay, yeah, this person must be good. But when you really dive into the layers of those undefeated records or whatever, then you really start to see some things. Some things are exposed, and you'll realize that oftentimes a lot of these fighters, especially this day and age by comparison, those records were built up off of competition that was less than stellar because it's a slow building process. And when you have a slow building process, the intent of it is you are in with opponents, and opponents are truly there to make you look good as a fighter. But this year stood out to me because of the fact that this was 1919, and I want to say it was year 5 for Harry Greb. He was about 5 years, 8 months into his career, based on my calculation, if I'm thinking correctly off top, and he went 45 and 0 in a single calendar year. And if you really pull back the layers of this competition, it was top shelf. He actually had a number of Hall of Fame fighters, former champions in the sense of back then. But these guys were actually champions at some point in time in their career. They may have been at that particular time, or at some points in their career, or moving forward in their career, they were champions. And these guys were littered throughout his 1919, where he went 45 and 0, along with a number of other contenders that people will probably be familiar with the names. They don't often get as much shine as some of the bigger names that we're accustomed to from there in the past. But this just pretty much put an emphasis on the, hey, all of these undefeated records aren't built equal. Now, if you know Harry Greb, then you know that he had well over 300 fights. If we think about it, just from a overall standpoint. So what this essentially shows you is that he was able to, in the midst of a 300 fight career, he was able to have a year in which he went undefeated in 45 fights against high level competition. And that is generally the top end as far as what we see with careers today. And now, if you'll see on the screenshot there, I strategically included both Rocky Marciano and Floyd Mayweather because those are probably the two most famous tied to a tied to an undefeated record. I would say people tend to reference Rocky Marciano's 49 and 0 reign as the world heavyweight champion, and then they tend to recognize Floyd Mayweather's 50 and 0 reign, primarily spent at in the welterweight division, I would say. Now, leading up to Floyd Mayweather going 50 and 0, a lot of mainstream media and the likes, they latched on to the 49 and 0 that Rocky Marciano retired at, and they symbolize this as being like a record in boxing, or the record, as far as this is, or these are the two undefeated people. Rocky Marciano being the famous of the undefeated, and breaking this 49-0 barrier is a major feat. But and while it was in some sense, not to take away from either of them, because those are pretty immense achievements for them to be able to go 49 and 50-0 respectively. But really what I wanted to show is that you have some individuals who fought way more fights and had extensive careers against high level competition. And while you look at their record at face value and they aren't undefeated, once you really pull back the layers and just take the entire career, take a fighter like Harry Greb or some others of the past, take their career in their entirety, and the fact that they were double, triple, and quadrupling some of these other fighters, then you really get a true sense of just how amazing and how good these fighters were, and how amazing it is the fact that Harry Greb was able to mix in a 45-0 year in the midst of his extensive career as far as the number of fights that he had down. And mind you, all of this by the age of 32. So he had that many fights in terms of when his career ended, and unfortunately his life as well. This was by the age of 32. So you have to really take that stuff into account when thinking about some of these records, or viewing a fighter who was undefeated and thinking that tells the full story of their career, and that somehow puts them in a place that hasn't been touched or is unseen. Generally, what Harry Greb did in that 1919 alone is something that is generally unseen. Will we see something like that again? No, we won't see anyone go 45-0 in 1 year, especially mixing in the number of Hall of Fame fighters that he took on in the midst of that actual run. And I even break it down in the video in itself there on the page. If you factor in just the guys, just the Hall of Famers, Leo Florian Huck battling Levinsky, Billy Misk, Jeff Smith, Mike Gibbons, and who am I missing here? I feel like I'm missing someone, but those guys for sure. It might just be those five, as a matter of fact. So when you break down those guys and their records as far as where they finished with their career, the total number of fights, that's each of them combined, that was 919 fights that they had in their career. So the average, one of the lowest amount was, I believe, Billy Misk. He had just over 100 fights, if I'm not mistaken. And you think about some of these other guys, they had 200 plus, battling Levinsky like 300 plus fights. Leo Florian Huck, nearly 300 fights as well. You just think about that. And that's where a lot of the difference lies when you're just thinking about some of these guys of the past and comparing them to the fighters of the day. A lot of those guys back then, they were taking on guys who had extensive fighting experience, especially in the pro ranks. And you have a lot of guys today. You see some of that today with some of these guys who are seasoned as amateurs, and there were amateurs back then. It was rare that you would see some that would spend the amount of time that you say you have with some of these Cuban fighters or Vasily Lomachenko or something. You know, we're talking like 300 plus 400 fights in the amateurs. But those guys back then, they were doing that as pros. A lot of them, they had to learn on the job. A lot of them, they didn't get any easy or soft touches. And this was a way of living, a way for them to actually make money applying their trade there in the boxing ring. So they weren't looking to take that slow build up process. They're willing to get in, jump in there with whomever at any point in time, even if they knew that the person they were facing was more experienced, but they knew in the end they were going to build from this as well. So those are some points that I certainly wanted to share right there off top, Random. And I know you were about to jump in, so feel free.
Yeah, just thanks to everyone who is or will be in the chat, and thanks to everyone listening after the fact. Yeah, he was so he's a middleweight, but he's while he
I think we lost you there, Random.
to lose the title. So Greb had multiple wins over battling Levinsky while he was the champ, is my understanding, but couldn't get the title. But if you're just talking about bragging rights, yeah, he's beaten up the champion among other great fighters in the weight class above his. And there's no intermediate weight class, there's no super middleweight. So Greb, while he's able to make, there's no 168 class. So while he's able to make actual middleweight, he's also fighting legit light heavyweights. And I think just shout out to Bruce and Ranger Danger. Thanks, guys. Rodolfo, what's up, brother?
Shout out Rodolfo. Shout out Ranger Danger. Shout out Bruce Gas. My people, appreciate you all dropping in.
Yeah, and shout out to two of my muses, Boxing Librarian, Scrapbook Boxing. Big up, fellas, always. Big respect.
Indeed.
And just thanks to you also, 86. You do some great work, man. I'm really enjoying your whole channel. I just strongly recommend everyone to go check that out. What I was saying about Greb is so the way I've come to see these eras in boxing, the early eras, because there are multiple eras. Boxing's a season. It's a season sport. So just like in other sport, the difference between it and say the NFL, the NBA, or the other leagues is that they don't have a set number of matches in boxing when it was a season. So not everyone has the opportunity to or the willingness to take 45 fights in a year. But for Greb to take that many and then win them all does stand out as possibly the greatest season, not just in boxing history, but arguably in sports history. If you look how many years people have been boxing and how many years and how many regions it's been very popular, and all these different people trying to put that work in, and this year being like this and not really touchable. And there have been some other great years. Jack O'Brien's, I think it's 1902, Philadelphia Jack O'Brien. He had a ridiculous 1902. But like a 6-round fighter, he would fight crazy levels of competition, but not all, but a lot of them were shorter fights. Greb does a lot of 10 rounds, no decision fights, because unfortunately, he's based in Pittsburgh, so Philly and Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is a no decision state. So that's where you see a lot of these wins where it says NWS on the chart. That simply means that the newspapers in attendance, not just people printing it like like multiple papers printing the same text, but newspapers in attendance would fight because the authorities wouldn't allow a decision barring a finish. So now we look back at it and we say, okay, majority of the papers picked a winner, or even if the majority picked a draw, that's what we go with. So that's what that NWS, the WNWS, that just means he won. The majority of the newspapermen who were on the scene scored it for him. And there are write-ups for these fights as well, especially the more notable opponents. So we don't have to just go on what the paper just said it generically. Some of these fights were very big. This was important stuff, and he was a big star by now. So there are pretty good write-ups of a lot of these fights. Same with a lot of other boxers. We're not just taking a generic piece of information on faith.
Mm-hmm.
You can go back and actually read the arguments between different writers and different newspapers, columnists, arguing about who won different rounds of a fight. Like they get deep down into the nitty gritty of, even though it's not a judge's decision like it would be in other places. So with Greb, his decision record is fantastic, and he had a lot of finishes, just not a high percentage, but he had a lot of finishes. But he also has a great number of fights in his home state where No decision was rendered, but these wins, most of these wins are clear wins. Some are closer, but that information is out there. That's all I'll say. That information is out there, especially when you're trying to gauge a season. This is a crazy season. I don't even know how many rounds he fought that year, but it's a whole career. He had a whole career in one season, and that's why, not for everybody, but for some people, when you think about how you're measuring greatness, well, if we're talking about individual years, this is the good stuff right here. It's not the only great year that even he had, but lots of people did lots of work. This is the extreme end of it, and I really appreciate you putting a video out on it.
Well, yeah, no
and
problem.
I'm looking forward to watching it. I haven't even seen it yet, but one thing about Greb was he was so good that he's beating the light heavyweight champion and he's beating heavyweight contenders, but he's the middleweight champ. At least later in his career, the middleweight champ Johnny Wilson just did not want to fight him. He was catching flack for avoiding him. But also the heavyweight champ Jack Dempsey, because Greb was considered a heavyweight contender because he was beating a lot of the other heavyweight contenders. Dempsey didn't want to fight him, so he's been avoided in multiple weight classes. Not avoided by everyone, because some people want to fight him, especially once he has the title, for opportunity. Like the great Mickey Walker moved up from welterweight, challenged him, did not win. They had a great fight. But then Walker would later win and hold the middleweight title. He just wasn't ready for Greb. There's no shame in that. But there are fighters back then who aren't as known today, who are really talented fighters, really tricky propositions, and they're just not famous, especially someone like Jeff Smith. I think his real name was Jerome Jeffers, but like Jeff Smith, he's not well known today, and he has sort of like a generic sounding name, but he was an important fighter. He fought everybody. It felt like, not literally everybody, but it certainly, he had one of those epic careers, really tough schedule. But a lot of guys in this time, some of the records get pretty deceptive because their win-loss for each year, sure, maybe you lost one or more fights every year of your career, but if you win 8 to 15 fights a year while that's happening, you can end up with 10 losses, but you have this crazy record because every season is important. That's the thing I think that really resonated with me about certain guys, especially Greb.
Yeah.
Every year of his career, you can look at as a season. I mean, that was a slow year, right? His debut year, he did some amateur work, he turned pro. He lost twice and drew, but still won, 6 fights? But year 2, that's pretty crazy, right? He only loses 1. He has some draws in there, but he's starting to fight some people. He's only in his sophomore season. Junior year, now he's picking it up, and but at the end of the year, he loses 2 on the trot, Tommy Gibbons and Perry Graves. But he's just getting going. So he's a tremendously experienced vet, but he's just getting going. And that's when it starts to pick up. And although he does suffer a setback there, George Chip, but once he gets into
solid fighter for sure.
Yeah. Once he gets into 17, 18, and 19, these are epic all-time great seasons. See, so look, in 1918, he loses 3, right? So newspaper loss, decision loss to Mike O'Dowd, Soldier Bartfield, and I think that was the fight that some papers had it a draw. So there's some debate now, but I've got it as a loss. But Soldier Bartfield got the best of him over 6 rounds in Philly. No decision
Jack
fight.
Dillon on this year, 1918. He beat Jack Dillon.
It's crazy.
If you don't know Dillon, look him up.
Jack Dillon is such a great fighter of a great era. Mike Mateague was no joke either.
Yeah.
But even Soldier Bartfield and some of these guys are really good fighters. It's just they're fighting in an era with some really great fighters. Just like we see now, when two great fighters collide, someone's going to lose that fight if it doesn't go to a draw. So if you're matched tough, you do pick up losses. Battling Levinsky has a great number of losses, but if you look at his career fight to fight, he's winning a ton of fights. So you go on these runs, but instead of nowadays, you might go over, say, 3 years, you go on a 7-fight win streak. Greb would put that together in a month and a half sometimes in some of these seasons. So he would go on these long runs and coming out of, look at that, it's crazy. But he loses to, Private George Ring, does that say? In London, he loses to close out 1918. But that right there, like 1919, all he's doing is going around getting the best of some of the best of his
That's a
generation.
career in itself right there. 1919 is a career. Like, just think about that. If you're a fighter today, 1919, 45 fights. I mean, that's a career.
It's so crazy. Oh, and in the interest of full disclosure, so thanks to, I can't remember who, but on Facebook, someone pointed out that's only 43. I actually cropped out a couple people on accident when I formatted it for the live chat with Scrapbook and BL. So that's only 43, but all the notable fights are in there. Just in case anyone has the OCD and starts counting and be like, it's all a lie. But even after that, you know, he does drop one to Tommy Gibbons, which he the next year, but then he avenges it. And look at that run he goes on. So he loses in May. You know, over 10 rounds, Tommy Gibbons gets the best of him in a newspaper decision loss. But then by the end of the year, he's put on a gigantic streak of fights, caps it off beating Jeff Smith.
Insane.
No decision. And so it's like how much momentum that you just can't. So like say like he's trying to get a fight with Jack Dempsey. He's doing so much work and can't get that fight because Dempsey wasn't very active, especially toward the end there.
And I'll just say, random, I just want to say, and I mentioned it in the video, you know, the video in itself focuses on 1919, but if you really dive into it, and 1920 shows it, he actually went 52-0 prior to suffering that loss to Tommy Gibbons. So he really went past 45-0. It's just that, you know, we recognize 1919 for what it was in that calendar year, 45-0, but 52-0 is what he actually went.
Right. And he did that in 17 months. And Crazy. He broke his hand in 1919. I think he broke it maybe possibly a few times, but he certainly had one like major break. But he took a few weeks off. He was less busy for a stretch there for some weeks or a month or more. But yeah, it's a gigantic streak. So that's why I think sometimes people who aren't familiar with this era, it's hard for them to compute why people hold it in such high esteem. It's almost like, okay, I don't know how many games they play in the NBA in a year, but say they cut that to 1/5 as many games in the year. And then it's not a variable schedule like boxing, but just generically put, if you take a sport and then you have the teams play as 5th as many matches as before, and then you try to compare them to the people who can do that exponentially larger body of work. That's what it's kind of like with Greb. Single years of his are like people's careers, like pretty good careers. And 1919 would be a great career. Like if you went 45-0 and you had all those wins over Hall of Famers without a loss, that's serious. Those are great fighters he's getting the best of there. Like who in other eras might very well have gained and held titles rather than. It's always been complicated though, because like I was saying, when he's beating Levinsky and some of these guys, like he's getting the best of them, but he can't get a decision. He's not so much a finisher, and some of these guys are real quality operators. They're not easy guys to finish.
Yeah.
So he can get the best of them, but he's not necessarily going to knock out Levinsky and then have a claim on that title.
And that's worth noting in the sense that this shows that he had to be built for going the distance. So I think that puts even more emphasis on it. So it wasn't like it's a situation where you can have a power puncher who at any point in the fight, of course, they can knock you out and get a W just because they have that pure power. Guys like Greb, you've seen the same with the likes of Maxie Rosenblum, etc., where oftentimes they had to get a lot of their wins by outboxing their opponents going the distance. So you had to be ready for that battle of attrition. You had to know that while you weren't the power puncher, your opponent could be very well more of a powerful puncher than you. So you have to be on your game and you have to be thinking the entire time in there to rack up these types of decisions against the level and caliber of fighter that you were facing. I mean, battling Levinsky, for instance, this is a guy who's bigger than Greb, and Greb fought a lot of guys who were bigger than him. Greb even, fought some heavyweights, battling Levinsky. He's fought at heavyweight. I mean, you have to think about it from that perspective as well. So I think it definitely worth some extra emphasis throwing that in, especially considering, as you mentioned earlier, Random, you didn't have these junior weight divisions and stuff to rely on. So if you were a middleweight and you had to face the light heavyweight champ, you didn't have any little catch weight or junior weight in between. You were meeting the light heavyweight champ, or you were meeting one of the light heavyweight greats. If it was a heavyweight and you were going up to light heavyweight, I mean, it is what it is. If you came in at 168 pounds and they were much higher, then you just had to deal with it. And Greb was one of those fighters, regardless of the weight, he just dealt with it.
Absolutely. And so he's legitimately like, and he's fighting. Yeah, the Hall of Fame ones are middleweights and guys who were considered middleweights and light heavyweight Hall of Famers. But like he's fighting Bill Brennan, that's one of the heavyweight contenders. So he's competing simultaneously in 3 divisions, and 2 of those divisions he's beating the best in the world, and in the third he's competing for an opportunity to get a title shot that he ultimately doesn't get. But he was really good. He didn't mind. He was so fast and pretty nimble still at this time in his career. He was so, I mean, look at the season he had. That's like, just like you wouldn't take someone who played 10 basketball games in a year and be like, they are Michael Jordan compared to the years Michael Jordan had. You'd be like, basketball hasn't done that with the games, but you could do that. It's like, okay, so the NFL season is now 3 games in the postseason, and then it goes to the postseason. Can you compete? Can you say now you're the 92 Niners? Totally, bro. You went undefeated. Well, hold on a minute. That's a different kind of season. And that's what Greb's like the extreme version of that. Hey, what's up, Elu? Always love to see that, you here and see that thumbnail, the Marciano uppercut. I think that is the epic Marciano uppercut thumbnail on the great Ezard Charles, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, so I've come to look at boxing like a season. I used to collect like football and baseball cards when I was a kid, and so I always liked like the stats, but really like today's combat sports, they can do stats with like strike count and certain things, but as far as like a season, you have to go back a little bit to get it that way. But my goodness, this is the extreme example, but he had every season there was something you could say about it. So his first year was still busy compared to today, even though there's less to be said about it as far as level of competition. But that's, in this time, I guess, like you were saying, not everyone stayed in the amateurs. Yeah, like a lot of people were like, yo, I got to make some money. Sam Langford, to what I can find, he won 2 fights a night as an amateur, and then he was the special event against the same guy he beat in the finals. He was a special event on a different amateur tournament, separate from the tournament. He won, and then he turned pro. So he got to get that money, man. Instead of like a watch prize or something, he wanted a real like prize money.
Yeah, certainly different times, they were built different back then, different times, hard times, we didn't have the things that we have now. We have the luxury of having, at least by comparison to when they were there. Of course, boxing was one of those main means for making money. And of course, it still is today. And that's why you still see the sport going on and people tying into it. But they had a lot of other options today as well, as far as we have basketball players, and with the NBA, the NFL being as big as it is, MLB, et cetera, et cetera. Back then, during the time that Greb was fighting, a lot of these things were sort of in that upstart stage. So boxing was very much the marquee place if you wanted to get to a check, and the biggest check is at the highest level. Then boxing was the sport that you wanted to go to. So think about that. That's why you had gyms on every corner. By comparison today, you don't see too many boxing gyms, and even some of the historic gyms have shut down that bred some of these champions from yesteryear. And that's just because the times in themselves are different. More are different now. More options are available now. More means and streams for you to get to funding in different ways. Heck, just think about us. We can talk about these boxers in a way that is different by comparison to what they were doing back then. Newspapers were the leading form of getting this information across back then, as far as what was happening, the fights and everything. And it is significant in that sense that these newspaper decisions, we relied on them. That's how the masses were able to get an understanding of what took place. And this is a good example of why the media piece of it mattered so much back then, and it still does today to a certain extent, but we go about it a little bit differently now. Of course, we can see the fights live, we can stream them live, and back then, yeah, you didn't have the luxury of doing so, so you relied on those papers and those releases, those telegrams that they were going through to the different cities and everything. So they put a lot of emphasis in that. And one thing I've shared in other podcasts, and I've shared with Random as well, is we talk about the fact that, hey, these guys were straight shooters. They called it like it is. Even if they were reporting on the hometown fighter, if they felt he lost, they would actually, spell it out, even in a fashion that, some people would be offended by, and that's just generally from the way they spoke about these different fighters, especially if you're a fighter who showed up and you really didn't put out, especially considering, people were paying to come watch you apply this trade and everything. But there were straight shooters in those newspapers back then as far as how they called those fights. So that adds some extra emphasis to it as well. And it's amazing. And I think that the reason we were able to speak on guys here some 100 plus years later is because of what these newspapers were able to take down, report on, write about, etc. And we get some pictures sprinkled in here and there as well, because as mentioned, we don't have any video on Greb outside of his newsreel video. So just think about how much it meant to have these varying newspapers that are reporting on these things. And it's no different than today. Of course, we still have newspapers. It's not really the main means for mass communication these days, but without this, picture us without being able to have some of these medias there ringside capturing some of these videos and things of that nature, just providing it for the people to see. It's no different. It's just we have more technology here today.
Yeah, we're incredibly blessed, and I love, like, most of the time I spend is just in the archives, just reading the newspapers and just trying to figure out what everybody was talking about as it was happening. Because people still had their biases, they had their own opinions, whether it was writers or judges or really refs. Because I'm not sure about Greb's time, but I know, like, in the generation before, in Langford's early prime, it was like a referee's decision. Judges didn't come into it, at least before this time. I'm not sure about Greb's time. I don't want to get ahead of myself there. This isn't my specialty at all. But we're incredibly blessed to be able to go back and see that. And I love to read, because you see, it's kind of, you can start crawling. If you find a thread, you can follow a thread back. So I was in a discussion on Facebook, so I went, it was something mentioning something that Nat Fleischer put in one of his Black Dynamite books. So I was like, okay, so let me look up Nat Fleischer, and so I looked him up, and it turned, like, from the description of his bio, it looks like he graduated. This was about something that happened in 1908 and 09 when Jack Johnson won the heavyweight title and wouldn't honor the contract that he'd signed to fight Langford if he won the world title. So we were having a debate, but, like, I went back and I was like, well, I know Nat Fleischer put one thing in his book that came out in, like, the late 30s. Mm-hmm. What did he say at the time? So he was actually working as the sports editor for the Sun, I think it was the New York Press or something. I had looked it up, and I looked up the column, and it's a very well written column. And he was sort of like, in that column, he was relaying something different than what was in his book written for casuals later. You know what I mean? Like, when he was on the beat, if that's him, or it's either that or it went past his desk. Unless I was greatly mistaken, it timed out, that. So I was like, so even sometimes what people themselves say changes over time. So I do try to go look at what happens then, especially people arguing about different things, who got the best of something or how to ref a fight. Because some refs were like, if it's not decisive, it's a draw. Yeah. And, like, even if there are rounds, and they're like when Langford fought Walcott, and they had that great 15-round battle, the ref was like, knew that Langford won more rounds, but he said Walcott's strong showing in the last three rounds made up for it. And he's the ref. He's the guy with decisions. So he was like, it's a draw. So he balanced it out. And the crowd thought Langford should have gotten it. That seemed to be the reaction of the people who were there live. But the ref was the man in that time. And in that situation, in other situations, the newspaper men basically are our way to figure out who won. So like when you go to Box Rec, at the top of the page, it has their official record. But if you scroll down, some of these guys, they have 100 or more fights that aren't at the top of the screen. But if you go to the fight to fight listing, it says just above that listing, it says how many times they actually got in the ring. And so like Jack O'Brien, I think he was somewhere around 100 fights officially, great record or something like that. But he had like 190 something fights. So those no decision fights, they were real fights, especially as to get an official decision or to take a title, you had to finish the guy in a no decision state. So some of these guys were really trying to finish the fights. And that's and people love exciting fights. So Jack Dempsey, part of his climb was he didn't fight some of the bad matchups, and he did a tremendous amount of knocking people out, including some good guys, and then people love that style of fighting. So Mike Tyson was kind of patted on that. Tyson was a big fan of Dempsey.
Yep, and that helped push the sport to the masses even more, just seeing that style of fighting. Of course, people come, they want to see knockouts. There's no question about it that we want to see knockouts, even if the fight is short. Some people will complain, about certain things in boxing. But if you're coming to a Tyson fight, I mean, there's an expectation, or there was at that particular time as he was fighting, that, hey, it could only last a round, but people clamored for that. They didn't care. Similar thing with Jack Dempsey. You knew you're just going to get some all-around exciting action from him, and I think it helped push the sport to an even higher level, especially in light of we were starting to move into into more modern times in a sense. The video camera was around and a prevalent thing there in the fight scene at that particular point. They would re-show some things in theaters and things of that nature. But of course, there were always some issues going on regarding the state to state. And of course, the Jack Johnson and Jim Jeffries that resulted in fights not being, it was fights. Their Congress enacting something to ban fights from traveling across state lines. Of course, people would do it backdoor bootleg style either way. But yeah, Jack Dempsey was integral in bringing the sport to a new level, especially to help usher in the heights where it is today. And just think about the fact that, hey, he wanted no parts of Harry Greb in an actual fight. Just think about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just like today. You could they just inducted. We can now say, the great Floyd Mayweather Jr. He's still doing exhibitions, but what I mean, if he's officially done with his decision fights, we could say, ironically, he didn't fight everybody, but my goodness, he did so much work in his career. So but that doesn't mean he fought everybody or went after the tough matchup stylistically or anything like that all the time. He's a clever guy. He went certainly probably the greatest businessman fighter of all time, and second to him would be probably Jack Dempsey, because there aren't too many guys who can say they've bankrupted a town with their purse, and the other guy didn't even get paid. So he's like, if you're talking about a businessman fighter and Sugar Ray Robinson, he knew how to twist the knife, last minute demands, And Hugh McIntosh actually complained, I don't know, but they were in a dispute later, so I don't know when exactly he said it, but he complained at some point that Sam McVeigh and Sam Langford were always coming to him for an advance on their purses and stuff like that when they were in Australia under contract. Yeah, that's a whole thing. That whole situation was very complicated. And I haven't fully researched it, so I don't want to speak too much on it, but yeah. But fighters, fighters have to get theirs.
I was just going to say that I can see that certainly, and it reminds me, I was watching like a Legendary Champions documentary last night, as a matter of fact. I know we were talking about that in one of the last podcasts, but Hugh McIntosh, he was the promoter behind Tommy Burns versus Jack Dempsey, and the two fighters couldn't agree on how to split the proceeds from for the film rights of this fight. So
Oh, you mean
they had
Johnson?
agreed. Yeah, Jack Johnson and Tommy Burns. Yeah, when he fought him in Australia, it was Hugh McIntosh who was behind it, and Hugh McIntosh had a film crew out there, and they started the cameras regardless of the fact, but they couldn't agree to splitting the proceeds. So the thought was that, hey, this fight wouldn't be filmed, there wouldn't be any film proceeds, but he thankfully recorded it anyway, and we were able to get that fight at least up to that last second. And that just goes to show you, yeah, there were a lot of politics involved in terms of some of the fighters as well. Just think about the fact that we potentially wouldn't have had that fight on film if it hadn't been for Hugh McIntosh just going out on a limb and saying, hell, I'm going to record it anyway.
Yeah. Shout out to Hugh McIntosh. Huge deal, McIntosh. That guy was a G. He thanks to him, because I'm pretty sure, well, I actually know, he was when Sam Langford went to fight Bill Lang, who McIntosh had promoted, and that was one of these guys. He was trying to get another title shot because he had fought Burns before, and actually Hugh McIntosh refereed the fight between Johnson and Burns, apparently.
Yeah.
So imagine how much shit he had to eat. Like, his guy's not only getting school, but he's got the best seat in the house, and he just has to take it. But he did some good business. He promoted Langford and McVeigh, their series in Australia. But he also filmed the fight against Bill Lang in London. I just wish they would have filmed, because they apparently came out to a military band.
Oh, wow.
With all this suit and tie event. Yeah, they came out to a military friggin' band. So I wish they'd filmed that as well. That would have been something to see, that walkout.
Certainly.
But the highlight that they were showing, and then also somebody filmed the 20 round draw he fought in his next fight, Langford did, against Sam McVeigh in Paris, because they were showing that he was doing speaking engagements, and it must have been McIntosh, because McIntosh, they were doing the speaking over the highlights in Australia in the lead up to their series. Which I thought was very interesting. So somewhere, it's hopefully in someone's vault or somewhere in a government archive, there is the reel that has at least some of, like, just like with the Lang fight, a highlight of McVeigh and Langford fighting in Paris. 20 rounds. 20 rounds. Not Langford gave up, that was in April that year. Langford was giving up 40 1/4 pounds to McVeigh.
Wow.
I think they weighed in. I don't know if they weighed in the afternoon or right before the fight. It didn't matter. It was at heavyweight, but yeah, he gave up, and they went 20 rounds. Pretty incredible.
That is amazing.
And Greb's fight with Walker, with the great Mickey Walker, who tried to move up and be a 2-weight. He wanted to be a champ back in the 20s. People are like, oh, champ, look at how historic it is. It's like, well, hold on a second. This aspiration has existed all the way back, because people are proving their class, quote unquote, meaning that's why, like, even it wasn't about how big you were. It was about how big you are on the mountain meaning everything leading up to the heavyweight titles, the establishment title, and then the colored heavyweight title. Those were the top guys. So when Jack Johnson fought Tommy Burns, Jack Johnson was a beast. He'd been the colored champ since 1903, and they fought in 1908. He'd lost a couple fights in that run, but he hadn't lost in any of those title defenses, if I got it right in my head. Just incredible. But Fitz right here, he wasn't a big guy, but he hit. He was the hardest hitter of his generation. So imagine the torque, but people say like Julian Jackson or Tommy Hearns, great Tommy Hearns. Some of these guys can really crack, right? Or like Joe Gans, for a little guy, he had a lot of knockouts. I'm pretty sure he had almost 100 knockouts, if I'm not mistaken. But Fitz right here, he could really punch. So it didn't matter that he was a little beanpole guy, beanpole legs, and all upper body, but like he could go. So he was, when we talk about fighters like pound for pound, I know everyone has their own thing. And often, it's a good idea to go by resume, because it's what you can actually prove. But you have a guy like Fitz who's competitive all the way up to the world-class heavyweight level. He's literally for his poundage. Same with Langford and certain other guys. You can be fighting at heavyweight and be one of the best or the best for your poundage, in the world anyway. You're not disqualified because you're a heavyweight. At least in the old
Yeah.
school way of seeing it.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, yeah, today it would be a lot different. You may not be able to get licensed to make such a jump, especially right off the bat like that. So it's certainly different. But yeah, Fitzsimmons, another one of those great examples. The fighting blacksmith, that's where he was able to generate that power. His work in the steel trade, learning it. I think we were talking about him in the last one. Getting his start there in New Zealand, Australia, that area. And he made his way to the U.S. and this is where he became an even bigger name. But you're right, they have some video out there of him. Of course, you'll see him in there. See him next to the likes of Jim Jeffries, who was a big stocky guy. Fitzsimmons looked like a skinny Tommy Hearns type, by comparison, of course, but he could still bang. And of course, these guys didn't care about size. So realistically, yeah, Jeffries was a lot bigger than him, but he didn't care. He ultimately lost his 2 fight to Jeffries, but Jeffries knew he was in there with Bob Fitzsimmons. You can best believe that.
Yeah, Rob was a real hard man, and he got, some unfortunate souls tried to rob him later in life. I think at a few occasions he had the way
Mm-hmm.
to deal with it, man. Those guys went to the hospital. He he was like, but I think he was in court at one point. I feel like one of these great Twitter accounts that does boxing history stuff tweeted out. I think it was something to the effect out of a court case. He was found not guilty because they said something about, like, he said the guy slipped, and to explain some altercation. I mean, like, some of these guys are real hard men. Fitz was he's that good. It doesn't matter that he was smaller. These are all these fighters I have on this right here. These are all great at middleweight. They also sometimes fought at different weights, but they're all great in their own way. The texture of each career is different. Like, Hopkins had a tremendous number of title fights compared to Greb. But if you talk about total fights and giving up size in fights, Greb's the man. But if you talk about giving up the most size, you're looking like Langford and Fitz. The size disparity in some of their fights is ridiculous. Greb was well to some degree. But Fitz and
Yeah,
Langford was just like, just crazy stuff. But circling back to Greb's 45-0, he had stopping power when he chose to, but he fought such a schedule. He also stayed light on his feet. So even though he added up a lot of finishes, it was a small percentage of his enormous career
yeah,
work. But Langford and Greb and even guys like Walker, these guys fought seasons. And Smith, some of these guys were busy. Part of what made Ray Robinson so special was, like, if you look at his year to year, that's how you can understand how he made such a big splash. How often people are reading about his exploits in the ring. It's not like today. We can get excited today. There's great stuff happening in combat sports, but we're not watching these guys fight every week or two. Some of them. So
mm-hmm.
if back in the day, if you're a fan of Harry Greb, you can cheer him along in a way that's just not possible today because of just how much work he's putting in. And when he was trying to get that heavyweight title shot, it was him. The clipping on the right there, that's him, and I think Tommy Gibbons. And he also had these battles with Tunney, but Dempsey, wasn't a stupid guy, and not every champion takes on everyone. Jack Johnson's run to the world title, in my opinion, and winning it versus Burns is better than what he did afterwards.
Oh yeah,
Because he wasn't
certainly.
fighting like prime Langford, McVeigh, Jeanette, Jeff Clark, and the other great fighters around his, at heavyweight. He was fighting the other guys for money, but he still did great things. His total career was great. So different textures. Greb didn't always get opportunity, but he sure put the work in. He died young, so we just give him his credit. So he didn't get any of the other good stuff that comes with being this great, all-time great
Yeah,
martial artist, because he was gone. So guys like him or the great Tiger Flowers, when they don't make it late, you got to celebrate them because they don't get anything else. So that's why
yeah,
I feel it's important Or like Barbados Walcott, one of the greatest pound for pound fighters, and a really little guy, even compared to Langford, who fought all the way up to heavyweight, had open challenge to fight any heavyweight in the world. That was largely not taken up, although some heavyweights did fight him, and he was still feared. He walked around in like the upper 140s. He could easily make 142 for fights. So he fought Joe Gans at 142. They met there, but
Broke Joe Chowinski's ribs in a fight.
yeah, but he was ended up clean. He was like a janitor or something at the end, in his later years. He didn't get to live out and be like.
Yeah, that is the case. There's a video out there of him. He was working for the Madison Square Garden. Yeah, he seemed to be a janitor or working those type duties there. And just think about that, one of these guys with one of these amazing careers. But much like even today, some of the boxers who make even more money, they end up losing a lot of it. But just think about it for those times and some of the feats that these guys had, especially a small guy like Barbados Joe here. I mean, just to think about, he got the short end of the stick in a lot of fights. Oftentimes, he certainly did, but he kept going. I mean, he didn't let it phase him. And even in the video that's out there, and I say you all should certainly look it up if you look on YouTube for him. But you can tell he's still a fairly humble man, regardless of it. And same with Sam Langford. He was one that held no ill will or harbored no ill will towards anyone, even with him after such an amazing career. And for him to have, at the end of his career, a lot of his money gone, another case of, sometimes he just got the short end of the stick. He would get paid, you can make a good living. I think we touched on this by comparison to some of the other trades out there, but just think about some of these guys and the type of money that they would have made with some of the things that we have now that technologically just weren't available back then. I mean, it's really remarkable if you really just sort of think through it, dive into it a bit. So just want to share that.
Yeah, 100%, Josh. You're on point with that. That's very well said, sir. And especially like for me, especially the guys who did the greatest things are often the guys who ended up with the least. And they weren't all just flamboyant. I mean, Langford spent money, but he was also taking care of a lot of people. He had a whole team of people. He's traveling with Liver Davis and Georgie Byers and Bob Armstrong and the manager, and so they're all eating off of his efforts. And he had a 75-25 split with his manager. But he kept a good schedule. He made a lot of money, but he also spent a lot, and he was generous. And so, later in life, he didn't get to just be comfortable and market himself the way someone could. Someone who had done what he had done today could make countless millions through media in a way that he never got to. So what do they get? Well, they should be celebrated because that's all they get. They didn't get to the other part. They didn't get to be George Foreman and make hundreds of millions of dollars as this personality and this great ambassador for just being a warm person, and also brand, like powerful brand, and he didn't get any of that. So they should be celebrated, and especially someone who did as much as he did. He was absolutely fantastic. I mean, if you were talking about the pound for pound greatest fighters of the era that led into Langford's, Walcott, Joe Gans, maybe a couple others, but he was that good. He was so feared by people his own size. Langford later, it mirrored that a little bit. When Langford was a middleweight, even guys who wanted opportunities weren't necessarily going to fight Langford, even though it was a huge name to beat. So he was fighting a lot at heavyweight. Even, like I said, like McVeigh, he gave up 40 pounds to him in Paris in April, the first fight they had that year, which is insane. Sam McVeigh was a tank. He got bigger than that, but like that, even then, he wasn't, because he wasn't particularly tall. So that 201 pounds or whatever it was, is serious. Like he was a dead serious dude. And Langford was giving up 40 pounds to him. So but I doubt he got like a tremendous amount of money for any single fight. Just a couple of the fights did pay him well, but generally he was getting it from volume, maybe side bets, but Walcott as well. You know, these guys that die with no money, we got to celebrate them. Not everybody gets to live out there. Now there are other guys who got screwed, like Harry Wills. He got screwed out of some opportunity, but he invested his money and he went out doing it. He owned a lot of property, I think, in Harlem. So even though he didn't get his chance, he did get to live out his life in some comfort. So that's pretty cool. When guys do get to do it, a lot of people, they run out of money, but you know, it's a certain kind of high risk personality that can thrive in combat sports is sometimes also pretty loose with their money. They like to push the boundaries. Greb's a great example of that. Like, he was living hard. He was fighting so often. That was his beating people up was his training for beating other people up. Like, he stayed in good shape, but he was also living hard. So later in his career, I think some of that dirty tactic, you know, like where he would take more liberties, you know, when he'd slow down and he's got one bad eye, and he was he was so driven. He's like, this is what I got to do. And this is not to speak bad of the executioner, but Bernard Hopkins, man, that's a guy. If you're talking about someone who knows all the moves, that's one of those guys, and he can really spoil someone's style. Like, even his fight with Calzaghe's my favorite dude, right? Like the Roy Jones fight, that's hilarious. Jeff Lacey fight, hilarious. The Kessler fight was epic and awesome. I love that fight. And some of his other fights, but Hopkins he gave him a lot more trouble. He knew how to spoil the style. Greb became that kind of fighter. It's like, that would be one of my all-time fantasy fights, be Greb versus Hopkins. So you can see Hopkins leading with his head, you know, and hitting on the blind side of the ref, and then Greb would be like, "Oh, really?" And so they would go at it. That would be Hopkins is one of those guys who could have, I believe, could have thrived in those. He was so tough. He could have thrived in that early era. He would have taken a lot of, you know, he could go, but he could also find ways to unlock people's style, you know, especially against like Calzaghe, because that's Calzaghe's thing, is to break down someone's style, like make it all come out wrong. And Hopkins did a lot of that to him in that fight. So he was old as hell when he did that. It's incredible. Greb was like much older in fight years, even though he was a younger man by the end of his career, but he was so good and he knew every trick, every single trick. So lots of guys took liberties, but some guys were real experts at it. And so later in his career, when he didn't have all of his speed and his eyesight, you know, but that's, you know, some guys wouldn't translate. They would translate differently for better and worse. You know, like Langford was good with the kidney punches, right? I don't think he could do that today. He had the long arms, right? So when you tie up, he could put some real leverage onto the kidney punches. I think it was Dixie Kid. Wasn't it Dixie Kid? He stopped him, retired him twice. I think he stopped him twice with the body shots, because his arms were so long and he was set so low, so you couldn't really do much to him if you're up close. But he had those really long arms. He had a tall guy's arms, so he could get that right around the back there and give you some good shots. So he couldn't do that today. But there are other things that people were doing to him that would work in his favor today, even as a little guy. But he wouldn't be allowed to fight heavyweights. They couldn't be like, so you're 160 and you're going to fight. Yeah, you can't do that. But he did an awful lot of it. It's pretty epic. So we celebrate it, even if they can't do it today. That's tough shit, you know?
Yeah.
Like they wouldn't let a general jump on a tank and lead into battle from the front like the Macedonian kings of old. But that doesn't mean that you pretend the Macedonian kings of old didn't, and they had a high attrition rate in part because of that.
Yeah.
Also court intrigue, you know, that led up to Alexander the Great's his whole run there. But you know, but they had a very high attrition rate on kings because they were expected to lead from the front. So just because today, you know, whoever, I don't even know a general's name, Schwarzkopf, he's probably retired. But anyway, you know, just because he can't lead the companion cavalry like straight at the Persian line from the front, doesn't mean he's somehow got more balls than Alexander the Great's crazy ass. And that's the thing with Greb, you know, just because you can't do it today, you can't go try to have 45 fights today, doesn't mean he didn't. He paid for it. So, but in terms of fighting spirit, that's the creme de la creme right there. Guys like him.
Yeah,
Absolutely driven.
you have to be thinking as a fighter. Also, you're just thinking about the likes of Greb and some of those others who would have 300 plus fights. There's a price that you're willing to pay. If you're going to go about it that way, a price and a toll that your body pays. So yeah, it's no secret that Greb, he was blind in one eye. But same with Sam Langford. He ended up being blind in practically both eyes at one point. That's a price you're willing to pay if you're those individuals who are willing to give it your all and go at it 100% like that and fight the amount of fights that they did against the level of competition that they did while they were of able body at that particular time, like when they were in their prime and all that stuff. Even when they were at their heights, they didn't duck or dodge any form of competition because the legacy piece of it also mattered to them in a way that it doesn't matter as much with some fighters. Some fighters, they'll tell you they're not willing to go to those lengths. And these guys were built different, just thinking about it from even that perspective.
Yeah, 100% well said. I made this graphic. This was leading up to Langford's fight in 1911, the one I referenced against Bill Lang, which I enjoyed because, one, he was giving up, I think, about 30 pounds to Lang, who was a former title contender, world title contender. But it was also filmed, so that's one of the 3 fights of Langford that we have footage. And fingers crossed about that fight with McVeigh, which was definitely filmed, was definitely shown. I've seen the newspaper clippings. I want to see that. So maybe one day. Fingers crossed. But these were just the notable opponents he had leading up. He debuted in 1902, but he got busy 1903 season. And these were just the notable opponents, some of them multiple times, leading up to that fight with Bill Lang in early 1911. And then the fight after that, he fights the great Sam McVeigh in Paris, gives up 40 pounds to McVeigh. And then he does a bunch of other stuff, and they fight again. At the end, McVeigh gets the best of him. He's only lost that year, but Langford was still a beast all the way. Even in 1920, when he's basically blind in one eye, he still has a tremendous amount of wins that year and a lot of knockouts. And he loses some fights, but his win-loss percentage is crazy. And he's a shell of himself. Greb was, I don't know if it was to the same degree, because Greb actually died young. He didn't fight into his 40s. He didn't get the opportunity, or even his mid-30s, poor guy. But he had almost as many fights, at least known fights, as Langford in so many less years. So he packed it in even more than Sam Langford, which is crazy. But Langford fought on forever. But he always had that punch. Greb didn't have that punch, but he went to more like grapple style and knew all the tricks. Like he'd do stuff like tie up your arm and then uppercut you around the outside of the arm he's tying up. You know what I mean? Like sneaking in under his own tie and like bap you in the head, like stuff like that. It's like he would just like put fists on the guy as fast as you can, but he could do it more from the clinch. He could adapt. Langford's kind of adapted. Certain guys could figure him out. Fred Fulton, keep him on the end of the jab, but most guys couldn't do it, couldn't figure it out even when Langford was way past it. But he wasn't the only one fighting a crazy schedule. Greb's schedule is equally insane, and it was actually busier. But like you're saying, some guys don't, we don't get to see the full expression of every guy. Like someone like Barbados Walcott, yeah, he fought a rich career, so we did get to see it. Fitz did a tremendous amount of work. We did get to see it. Mm-hmm. Even Jack Johnson, hit the sum of his career is epic. Even though he didn't fight those certain heavyweights in his world title reign, it was still epic. Langford did a lot of work, but someone like I don't know if I can even find the graphic, but someone like Stanley Catchell, he died in his 20s. Not in the ring. He was murdered on his farm, but so we never got to see everything. But if you look at what he did, he had quite a career, including challenging Jack Johnson, knocked Jack Johnson down before getting absolutely brutalized once Johnson stopped playing with him. Johnson was so good, he could play with guys, so he could just mess with their feelings, like beat him up, grind on him, and shut him down, basically. But once Catchell hit him with that big punch, he got up and just floored him. But Catchell had a pair on him, and he did fight Langford, even though it was only 6 rounds. He fought Langford. So you got to give credit. And he was a young guy. He was only 23, I think, wasn't it?
Yeah. Somewhere around
and he
there.
died.
23 or
He was pretty.
24 for sure when he died. Yeah, for sure. It was one of those two. And he had accomplished a lot just given his age thus far. Just think about what it could have been because, he had already been middleweight champion of the world. So just think about what could have been just had he been able to continue his career in some of the mouthwatering matchups that were out there that we didn't get a chance to see. For instance, him against Greb probably being one of the key ones.
Oh, that would have been magnificent. And just real quick before I move back to the Greb, set of pictures, but like when Langford was old, here was his schedule when he had been blind in one eye for 2.5 years. Like he got injured in 1917.
Wow.
Well, let me see if it'll pull up. There it is. Look at that schedule he fought. There he is. That's actually a photo of him from a training camp in 1920. Look how little he is. He was a serious proposition, even when he was old. So like, when people say, why would Dempsey want to fight him? He was old. But look at that win-loss record with stoppages. Like he knocked out George Godfrey, who was enormous.
Yeah, I was just seeing that.
Knocked him out in 2 rounds. You know what I mean? He had no business winning that fight. Even though Godfrey, I don't think Godfrey was very experienced at that point. And I think he's actually been training him. So he kind of knew him. He knew his gaps. But Langford was a terrifically powerful person even when he was 1,000 years old. So Greb didn't get to do that thing, but maybe he would have kept the Langford schedule.
Yeah.
But he actually exceeded it, but maybe he used himself up a little fast. He lived pretty hard. Langford lived comfortably, but I think he lived a little less. He liked his drink and cigars, but he wasn't doing a Greb level like party machine.
Yeah.
Party machine variation. Like Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh were very serious. They stayed in excellent shape. Those great battles they all had with each other. And I think, a lot of documentaries, they kind of skip over their incredible work to talk about Johnson and the White Hopes. But the reality is that Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh beat most of the White Hopes. These were the guys that people couldn't get through to get to Johnson.
Mm-hmm.
He fought Al Kaufman, who didn't fight any of them. But so it's like they're not remembered for all the work they did. Langford especially was the guy. He was going to beat all the White Hopes and force Johnson to fight him. It's like Al Kubiak, Jim Barry. He wanted to fight Al Kaufman, but Kaufman's manager drew the color line firm. But Bill Lang, Hugh McIntosh wanted Bill Lang to beat Langford. He put on a big ritzy event, like coat and tails type event. He had Jimmy Britt emceeing it, his tuxedo and military band, but he did like a catered event the day before with some sparring. And Langford actually did some play sparring with some kid. He let some little kid knock him out. There it is. Look at this. Boom. Go, brother. Got him. And then the ref called it a draw. Robbed him of the knockout. But like, these guys, even though they weren't champions, world champions, they were big stars. I guess that's the point I'm making, is like they were doing big things. It was a big deal. And so Johnson not fighting them, they were still doing great things. They were still headlining. They were still making money. They were still all up in the newspapers. So it was a very rich time, even though there was that layer of frustration about, how much they were or weren't doing. Johnson was or wasn't doing, because that was also entertaining a lot of people, his work. So it's complicated. It's a complicated time, but Greb came in later. I think he debuted, was it 1913?
Yeah.
So he came in a little bit later. Langford debuted in 2002. But but Greb fought one of those old school schedules. And actually, to be fair, like a lot of people were fighting like a Langford, some version of like that Langford Jeanette McVeigh schedule, very busy in Greb's era. That was almost like the peak of it. And his 1919, to circle back, his 1919 is the perfect expression of that era. That's a schedule. That's a season right there. He kicked so many asses that year. So it's great that you did the video on it. great that you did the video on it, and I look forward to seeing it. I didn't actually get to watch it yet. I just saw the notification as we were. I was like, oh,
Oh yeah,
we should go live, talk about
yeah.
his greatness. And Greb, like, he kept it. So this is his magnificent 1919, but he wasn't, even when he got injured in one eye, he wasn't done. His second to last season, so I guess this would be his last full season. Look at that record. His only loss is to Gene Tunney.
Yeah, that's
He beats
insane.
Mickey Walker, holds off Mickey Walker, beats Rosenblum, wins it just a ton of. And then even his final year, he kept a winning record for the season, even though he died.
Yeah.
Just Tiger Flowers. And I think
Jimmy
you said
Delaney,
one of those was controversial.
Yeah, Jimmy Delaney. That was another good fighter from that time. Allentown Joe Gaines. I mean, he was taking no layups, even in the shape that he was in.
Right. He'd have enough big fights, and then he would squeeze in all these little fights in between. He loved to fight. He was there for it. Lots of guys love to fight, but he lived in an era where it was possible. All the different clubs and promoters and all the different, there were so many roster slots basically, and he was about it, and he was famous for that. And he lived hard, and he lived hard. He died young, but what he actually did in combat sports it's just silly. It takes a while to study. It takes a while to soak in. He wasn't the only one though. A lot of these guys had tough schedules. So it's not to put down anyone who had a shorter career, like someone like Dempsey. Dempsey did a lot of other stuff, exhibitions and sparring beyond just fights, fighting for purses, like in a full-on fight. Like a lot of these guys had other stuff going on. And Greb didn't get to really do any of that because he was about some Harry Greb, and then he died before he could get to that stage because he probably would have made a great coach. Think of all the great fighters he'd seen. Nearly 50 fights against Hall of Famers, right? Isn't that it?
Yeah.
Pretty crazy. But he didn't get to do it. And Langford went blind, so even though he was doing some training and stuff like that, but he could, some appearances, but he couldn't really couldn't see well enough to do that. He didn't get to that. I don't know what happened with Walcott, why he ended up that broke, but it's a harsh sport. So like today when people are frustrated, I don't get quite as frustrated because I'm like, yo, these guys are getting paid.
Certainly.
These guys are getting the money to get their asses kicked and kick it. Because, even in a win, you're getting hit to hit people, you're still getting hit back even when you win convincingly. I feel like sometimes in these fantasy matchups too, people think of someone's highlight reel rather than think of their entire fights when they think about how some of these guys would match up against each other. Because you look at say Roy Jones Jr. was spectacular, but he did get hit in fights. He wasn't never hit. So if he had been fighting harder hitters, like some of these great punchers from other eras, if he can be hit, some of these guys, their devastation factor when they do land is good night. Same with especially Langford. His left hook and his right straight was a good night punch. Nobody stood with him, even the bigger guys. When he was at his best, nobody stood with him. Not Sam McVeigh, not Bill Lang, not Joe Jeanette. Nobody came in and tried to bang it out with him, even though he was the little dude. So some of these guys, like Jones, was spectacular. And say at 168, he was at or near, maybe that was his best. So he was cutting weight to 168, but he never fought a puncher like Langford. I'm not saying who would win that fight because he was remarkably fast and clever and just brilliant in his own right, but it's not a gimme for either guy. But I think people don't think of the full fight rather than the highlight reel. If you think of the highlight reel, you'd be like, can't be touched, can't be, but he could be touched. And so someone like Langford, you can't let him hit you flush with the left hook or the right straight. It's mind-bending power. So that's a fight I'd love to see.
Certainly
Certain
interesting
fights,
to think about.
Yeah. It's great to have you here just to rant about these fighters. It's a lot of fun because they did so much, and it is like the team sports are. You can look at real years, like actual seasons, and so to circle all the way back. Everybody, go check out that 1919 season video right now on Harry Greb. This is not a link. You'll have to go find it, but
Yeah, certainly. Yeah, yeah. Just you go to 86 boxing, you'll see it. But certainly, yeah, great points you've made here. In boxing, much like any sport where there's a history built in, and boxing probably has the deepest history of all the major sports, of course. But anytime there's a history built in, you have those who sort of are prisoners of the moment, but they really haven't taken the time to dig into the past of some of these other fighters. We see similar comparisons, and we talk going back in basketball to the old Celtics and how they were such a great dynasty, and people question whether, hey, like how good were they? And it's just a different time, you know. But you know, these great fighters from the past are adaptable. They're adapted to their times, and I'd expect the great fighters of now to adapt to the times of the past if they were in there. So just think about it from that perspective. The playing field will be different, of course, if a fighter from this time went back then. I mean, so it certainly would be more of a strain just by comparison. But these great fighters, they are adaptable, and I think you'd see a lot of these great fighters from today, this modern time, adapt and be fairly good back then. Some of them, especially those that you're accustomed to seeing walk away with one or two losses or things of that nature, it probably wouldn't be the case. Some of them would likely just be contenders, but it was just a different time, and just the multitude of fighters that were out there fighting at a high level at those times back then. Yeah, it was a lot more of them. So, but certainly it's worth, having these talks and making these comparisons. But I commend people like yourself, as well as the other sort of boxing historians or historians in the work, I guess you can say, who are really digging into the past and the careers of some of these fighters like Greb, Gumbold Smith, Bob Fitzsimmons, Sam Langford, Sam McVeigh, et cetera, Jack Dillon. You know, digging into these fighters of the past, because if it weren't for some of us here in the modern day telling the stories or keeping the stories alive and kind of passing them on, then they too can be forgotten. And we know how it is even here in modern times. Privy myself as someone who likes to keep up with the sport of boxing. I pretty much stay in the know on what's happening here in present times. But even now, of course, I can't see every fight. I can't keep up with every story. There's no one person can, of course, but it's similar in a similar nature to that. How we have some fighters out there right now who are very good, who are not well known. Similar thing with the fighters of the past. Oftentimes, a lot of it is people are ignorant to the fighters of the past, not ignorant in a derogatory fashion, but it's just some of these guys, their names just haven't come across their radar. And unless you actually take the time to kind of dig into it and learn the stories yourself, then you won't know. And thankfully, we have people putting it out there, as mentioned. But I don't consider myself a historian or anything of that nature. I too was in a place once where, yeah, I didn't know who Harry Greb was. I wouldn't have known who Sam Langford was if you asked me. I just kind of took the time, much like what Random is doing, much like what everyone does, to kind of just study the history and dig into it a bit more. And it helped me become aware and privy to some of these great fighters of the past. So all it is the same thing across any sport. If you take the time to look back, you'll see that, yeah, there were some pretty amazing fighters, just as there were some pretty amazing athletes from back in the day, just as they are now.
Yeah, 100%, brother. And some of these guys, like thanks to, I love your videos and the Boxing Librarian, Scrapbook Boxing, and some other these great channels. Guys, I didn't realize how hard some of these guys were matched. Like you hear about some of these guys are most notable in the way they're remembered, at least for their losses, or at least as their wins. So that doesn't tell the full story of their career. Like people might have heard of Ketchel casually because Jack Johnson knocked him out, and there's sort of legend he knocked his teeth out and was brushing the teeth out of the glove. I don't know if that actually happened or not. I haven't really looked at it, but that's a myth. But anyway, he's kind of known for that. But Stanley Catchell was one of the best welterweights and middleweights. Like, he was a ferocious welterweight who became a destructive middleweight. But apparently at welterweight, he might have been one of the hardest hitting welterweights of all time. Certainly a lot of people felt that way about him. And that's saying something, because, you know, he didn't come long after Barbados Walcott, who was a welterweight who was remarkably feared for his power, to where he could hurt heavyweights to the body. But Walcott, you know, unlike Ketchel did have that foray to heavyweight against the great Jack Johnson, but Walcott had an open challenge at heavyweight. He wanted to fight the best of the big guys, even though he's this little dude.
Yeah.
Greb was like that. He was a larger person, but he was like that. Just because he was 20 pounds heavier, there's some big guys. You know, he desperately wanted that Jack Dempsey fight. But Dempsey wasn't stupid. You know, it wasn't a good style matchup for him. So he's not the only champ in history who was like, I can fight these other guys. You know, there are lots of good fighters at that time. You know, it's not to say anything bad about the guys Dempsey did fight, but it would be fair to remember him as much for some of the great fighters he didn't fight. Because this was an era when some of these guys like Greb did try to fight everybody. Harry Wills and Harry Greb, they had, a sober look. Each of them has probably a better resume than Dempsey, even though they're all great fighters. They don't have the acclaim, but if just looking at the resume and how many high-level wins, I mean, Wills, he took over one of the greatest heavyweight divisions in history, one of the richest. 3 all-time greats all at the same time, you know, and then a lot of badass fighters around it. Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, and Wills came in. He was matched tough, and then he became the main guy. He was avoided, but, you know, when we look at sports history, we don't, you know, the championships are complicated, but he held the colored heavyweight title and had a remarkable run there. So I feel like two things people should think about with the early eras. It was a season, and not all titles are created equally. And when people say undisputed, that's not exactly accurate. Jack Johnson was briefly undisputed, but then he didn't defend the colored heavyweight title. And so they started fighting for it the next year, Langford and the others. And so then he was disputed again. So he was probably like 8 months undisputed. And then he wouldn't defend one of his titles. And then there was another heavyweight champion in the world. So people don't necessarily remember it that way casually, but I don't care about that. I just go look in the papers and see how they talked about it. I mean, they were living it. So unlike today, I'm trying to figure out how they were living it then and what everything meant. There were a lot of title claims, but a lot of times it just led to big fights. It's like, I claim at 158 pounds. Well, I claim at 160. Well, let's just fight. Let's see who's got the claim. And sometimes, like after Ketchel died, there were a lot of people, is my understanding, trying to be a middleweight claimant. They worked it out after a while.
Yeah. And if I can add, I'll just add, especially just thinking about the heavyweight title history. If you really think about it, it probably wasn't until the 30s, late 30s, actually. And in particular, I'm thinking of Joe Louis, where you really saw someone who really took on the title. And when he won it, actually, you know, just took on all challengers in some sense and really defended it for a number of years. But prior to that, so if you think about the likes of Jack Johnson, Jack Johnson and Jack Dempsey, they kind of mimicked what they had seen beforehand, because it dated back to John L. Sullivan when he got the reign in some sense as heavyweight champion. I mean, his reign in itself was really nothing spectacular, especially under the Marquess of Queensberry rules. Same with James J. Corbett. He barely fought. A lot of these guys went into theater at that time. Same happened with Bob Fitzsimmons. We know he's a hard-nosed fighter, but when he actually won the title, he didn't fight as much. He didn't defend the title as much. I mean, because it came with so much fame and accolades at that particular point that you get preoccupied with other things, and to carry that mantle and title of world heavyweight champion back then, it meant so much more by comparison to what it is today. You're literally known across the world, and we relatively have some of that today. I mean, Tyson Fury, he's a major figure in the sport of boxing, but just think about the likes of Jack Johnson. I mean, or Jack, not even Jack Johnson, but Jack Dempsey is what I was thinking of at that particular time. You're talking about maybe the most popular person in the world, him and Babe Ruth. And that's just across the board. That's how much that heavyweight title meant at that particular time. So, of course, the stars came calling, the things start to align. You had movie offers. You could start making appearances, doing other things to preoccupy your time. That's why you see videos of him out there with Charlie Chaplin, who was I guess the leading actor or filmmaker or something of that nature at that particular time. But just so Jack Johnson, he saw that. He saw the amount of money he could get. Of course, he wanted to try and hold on to the title as long as he could as well. And therefore, yeah, he didn't fight those that tough competition once he actually won the title. So I would say, yeah, it really kind of just lasted. Jess Willard, when he beat Jack Johnson, he barely fought, even though he wasn't one who had a massive career. But it took him to a new level of stardom that he hadn't seen, just as it did Dempsey, just as it did with Gene Tunney, so on and so forth. But I would say really there after the late 30s, once you got into the 40s, that's when it kind of changed a bit in some sense, as far as Joe Louis just starting that process of, he was just taking on whomever, just to solidify his reign there as champion, fighting more than any other heavyweight champion in some sense while they held the reign with those title defenses that he had. So just wanted to throw that out there.
Absolutely. Well put, sir. Yeah, it was, he did, if you're talking about a heavyweight champion and you're talking about someone who did it right, and you're not, unless you're talking about some of the colored heavyweight titles, because those were very hotly contested the whole time.
Yeah.
Often with busy schedules. Like Langford had a slew of dozens and dozens and dozens of fights for the colored heavyweight title. Harry Wills had a bunch himself. That was very hotly contested. But if you're talking about the establishment title, the way that people, when they say undisputed, like Joe Louis was legitimately, unquestionably the top guy, and he fought so many times, defended that claim so many times that there was no question who the top guy was. There was absolutely no question. There was just a series of people who got to try, but there was no one was like, maybe it's not Joe Louis. It was Joe Louis completely. He proved it. But I want to just give a shout out to Tommy Burns, because although not all of the opponents were super high level, but when he won the title, that man put on some fight. I think most of it was in Australia, if I'm not mistaken, but he fought a bunch of title fights between I think so. I think
I was going to say he was the
08.
first. Yeah, he was the first to really take that heavyweight title on the road in a true fashion and defend against the champions in the other countries. So he was the first to really do that. So props to him for sure. He's one that has to be mentioned, Tiny Tommy.
Yeah, shout out to him, because Fitzsimmons was a huge star, and he did a lot of exhibitions and sparring and appearances. I mean, and he raised this, he wanted a certain amount of money to put fights together, and he was about it. He was about getting his. And so he wasn't, like you said, he wasn't a busy champ, but Tommy Burns was very much a busy champ, and he even fought something that other champions hadn't done who were celebrating their day, but he fought top black fighter in the world, and the guy who most people thought would beat him, and he got a lot of money to do it.
Yeah,
that might have been a record at the time. He got $30,000 for the fight, but he did fight him. He did put it up against Johnson, so I give him credit for that, even though he got probably 6 times as much money as Johnson did, or maybe even more, but he did. And so, like you said, Johnson just followed the pattern he'd seen. When the guy gets the heavyweight title, he cashes in. He does it, and Johnson could do that. He'd go do engagements. I'm pretty sure he went on tour. For a little while. Like, people wanted to see him. He could make money that way too. It was so the contract he had to fight Langford. He basically asked for, I think it was about 6 times what the contract was. He said, you raise that money there. You can't tell me what to do, but that money there, you raise it sixfold, and we can talk. For the Langford
Yeah.
fight in London, they didn't match it because that was super crazy money by standards. That would have been equal to the payday that Burns had just gotten. But Johnson,
Hey,
cashed in the way other guys did.
let me just jump in there. I just wanted to say I just went and looked at a inflation calculator just to throw that number in there, that 30,000. It only let me go back in this particular site I'm on to 1913, but that would have been the equivalent here in 2022 of $885,745.45. What Tommy Burns got paid to take on Jack Johnson when he was in Australia. And if you think about it at that time, that is an insane amount of money considering, the first $1 million gate didn't happen until Jack Dempsey fought George Carpentier. And just think Tommy Burns would have gotten the equivalent of that in some sense when he took on Jack Johnson for that single fight. So it's hard to turn something like that down.
Yeah, absolutely. Hugh McIntosh making the big fights out here. That fight with Bill Lang and Sam Langford, and that was a big fight. But this time, so even though Johnson wasn't necessarily busy, because after he fought Jeffries in 1910, he took a couple of years off. He made a ton of money in that fight by the standards of the day. So he was having trouble. They were trying to use the Walker Law to give him a hard time. He had that whole thing going on. So he took a couple of years off. But just one of those years, 1911, I use this quite often just to illustrate a point, and because it took a long time to type up, so I try to use it often. This is Langford, Jeanette, and McVeigh, the top contenders to Johnson that year. That's their combined record for the year. And Johnson didn't fight. So if you're ranking what's the top title? Is it the establishment title or is it the colored heavyweight title? Well, I would say the guy's doing this kind of work. And if you look, one of them appears in, I'm pretty sure, every listing there, either Langford, Jeanette, or McVeigh were either won or drew. Yeah. So I'm pretty sure they only lost to each other that year, if they lost at all. So Johnson took the year off. So people in a documentary, people would be like, yeah, Johnson came back, and they would just skip that part. But look what they're skipping. They're skipping some of the greatest heavyweight fights of all time. And this went on for a couple years. So, this era doesn't get, one thing I noticed once I got into the era and started looking at it, it's under-celebrated, partly because Johnson was fighting the White Hopes, but they were all fighting White Hopes too. They beat up a whole heck of a lot of White Hopes themselves. It's all in the papers, because they were like, we're going to force Johnson to fight us by beating every other aspirant for the title shot. And some guys like Tony Ross got to fight Johnson. He'd already lost to Langford. People got to, or Johnson fought like the great Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, where he was a huge star of a few years he was getting past it, you know what I mean? But he fought him, and it's a money fight, and it's a big name because Jack O'Brien was a gigantic star, even though he was as an athlete, he was getting up there. Mm-hmm. But Langford fought him as well, a faded version, and schooled him. They had a lot of common opponents, but it was just the politics of the day didn't stop the great fights from happening, and it didn't stop anyone from making money. It's just the other three guys didn't get to make huge money like Johnson, but they were making money. They weren't living in poverty. It wasn't, so the purses might be large, but not staggering. One thing I love about today is lots of $1 million purses, man. Lots of people making lots of money.
Indeed.
They deserve it. These guys did not get that. Even with inflation, they didn't get that. Got nothing. McVeigh died young. Langford went blind. Jeanette had some businesses and stuff. Johnson did better and worse, had some troubles too. They didn't really get to be comfortable. So a lot of the athletes today, after they're retired, and you see them like Lennox Lewis and some of these great fighters, and you get to see them, you're like, oh, good, they're doing pretty good. After a whole career of fighting, because a lot of these guys didn't get to, even though they were intensely entertaining and just putting on these great schedules, all these great fights. Langford, had enough humility to clown it up in the lead up to the fight. He didn't have to act like a badass. He was a happy-go-lucky guy until he got in the ring. If he was in the mood to get serious, he could make a gigantic knockout artist like Sam McVeigh fight on the retreat. Imagine that. Imagine a guy giving up 40 pounds and making the knockout artist fight on the retreat. That's what Langford managed to do with McVeigh, and McVeigh fought enough other people to show he was a supremely good knockout artist.
Without a doubt.
Crazy stuff. Yeah, Langford and Greb, those resumes, part of the reason I just like to discuss them so much, especially with someone like you who's like also interested in this era, is
shout out to Harry D who dropped into the chat. Harry D.
Hold on. Yeah, he's trying to get a little bit edgelord. No, let's not have that. Sorry, Harry, you're welcome to listen, but not in the chat, like with that language. We're going to try to have that type of discussion. It's just out of consideration for other readers, because this is mature content here. This is like we're talking about the racial dynamics of this era, of this crazy era in boxing. So, grown up stuff only.
Yeah, I thought the name was pretty precarious.
Yeah, we're not going to shout out that name either. Like, it's just, it's just not the right place for it. Think of this, the library, man. You want that crazy stuff? You can't be in the library.
I wasn't sure if it was a colleague or something, but yeah, that's pretty crazy.
I wasn't either, but the second comment, it's like that's enough of that. We're not paying attention to that kind of thing. What we're paying attention to is something like the magnificent Sam Langford, who could give up. This is just sparring, but like that's Big Bill Tate. He was big. I mean, Langford's like 5'7.5", but that you can see the size difference. Like George Godfrey was a giant, and Sam as tall as those guys, but he was so thickly built, famously tank-like. And he fought Johnson, giving up size. So Langford, Greb, guys like Barbados Walcott, the great welterweight, who was the multi-weight beast. Guys like Fitzsimmons, these guys were like, they didn't need to like get the size just right. They just went up and did it. So I hold guys like that above.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not a knock on anyone else, man. It's intensely difficult to be hugely successful in the realm of fighting.
Yeah, so there's a vid out there. There's a vid out there of Kid Norfolk fighting Big Bill Tate, and you'll see he has to pretty much jump and leap into every punch to make a connection with him.
Oh, which one?
Kid Norfolk versus Big Bill Tate. Bill Tate, of course, he was also a sparring partner of Jack Dempsey, so that tells you how he was regarded.
Oh, nice. I think I got a picture of Kid Norfolk. There he is.
Kid Norfolk.
Yeah, and there's some great fighters in that era, in that general era, that are even like more overshadowed than Langford, Jeanette, McVeigh, and Johnson, but there are other really powerful fighters in there who also didn't get their opportunity, like the Joplin Ghost, Jeff Clark. He had a gigantic career. He fought so much at a high level. He mixed in with all those guys. He didn't get the better of his win-loss record against some of the greatest heavyweights of all time wasn't spectacular, but which is pretty spectacular. Be able to fight at that level and stay at that level and be competitive. He was hard to pin down. So, but he also would go in other guys' training camps. He was a sparring partner for a lot of high-level fighters because Jeff Clark was so technically good and so mobile, so clever at staying away. So he's definitely useful beyond just being a great fighter. I feel like he should be in the Hall of Fame. There aren't that many guys. Only a handful of guys who've spent more time in the ring with Hall of Famers. I mean, he mixed in that company more than almost anyone in history. There's only a few guys, a little handful of guys that have more rounds against Hall of Famers, which is crazy.
Yeah, that is.
Langford's the king of that, but he also spent a lot of rounds in the ring giving up size to powerful fighters, just not Hall of Fame kind of level material, like battling Jim right there. A gianter, man, and another guy who fought a really tough schedule. So his win-loss record against these all-time great heavyweights isn't spectacular, but his win-loss record against everyone else he fought is pretty damn good. Some of these guys had enough fights they could prove they were among the top, even if they couldn't beat the top of that pyramid. They continually proved they could still beat up a lot of other guys. And some of these year-to-year records, like these seasons, there's a lot of supporting around the big fights. There's a lot of supporting evidence, and Greb's career was like that. Take on all comers, whether they're high-profile fights or just other guys. They'll take them on too, giving up size because they have less experience, and kept a winning record doing it that way. So pretty incredible. I think we've been talking about hour 40, and I believe I need to go to my other job. So, Josh City, it's great sitting here ranting about this old school stuff back when boxing really was the season. Great stuff happening today, but it's just a different framework. I'm a little more fascinated by the kind of work they were putting in those days, because you could see people mix so frequently in high company while allowing for prospects to get their whacks at a top-level fighter. It's like what people would say, well, Greb was fighting some of these guys who were overmatched. Yeah, but they're getting an opportunity to upset a top-level guy, and styles make fights. Look at all those different styles that he faced in 1 year, as well as the fights in bold there, the really legendary opponents. But, look at all the other guys that got to take a swipe. I mean, Fury almost got stopped on cuts by a prospect, right? Sometimes you just have a bad night, but Greb managed to go that year without having a bad night, even though he broke his hand that year. Pretty insane stuff. Well, Josh, thanks for coming by. Thanks to anyone watching after the fact, anyone who made it to the end. If you skipped to the end, welcome to the end. Go check out that video on 86 Boxing. And just thanks everyone for listening. Hopefully we didn't ramble too much, but it's good to celebrate some of these guys, especially guys who were iconic in their day. Fitz especially was like, he wasn't, whether he held the world title or not, once he was in that mix, he was a superstar on a level that fighters don't really get today. He was like a cartoon character. I'll put it that way. Dempsey achieved that himself.
Oh, yes.
Langford, although he didn't get the quote-unquote world honors, but Langford as well. But someone like Dempsey, yeah, his marketing. I'd only put maybe Floyd above him as a businessman fighter, because in the context of his times, he made that money. He got that.
Without a doubt. But thank you, certainly, Randall, for having me on. Of course, always great to come on and have a chat about some of the historic stuff that took place in the past, and celebrate that stuff here today. So I appreciate it, certainly.
Very cool. Now I'm going to go check your video out, then I'm busting out to work. You have a great day, Josh. Thanks for coming on, brother. Thanks to everyone. And look forward. We've got a top 10 middleweights of all time countdown that's scheduled, I believe, for this coming Saturday, 4 p.m. Eastern time, with the Boxing Librarian, Scrapbook Boxing. I'm not sure if I have confirmation on, because we rescheduled it from Saturday, but that's probably when it's going down. So look for that. I'll have it up on the channel. If there's any changes, I'll have it adjusted in the link. So thanks for coming on. Josh, take it easy, brother. And everybody have a great day.